Good day to everyone. I suppose it's day, maybe for most of you. And thank you for being here and for taking the time to be virtually together and to listen to me. I want to repeat my thanks to Dr. Gregorini, Pablo, who through the invitation motivated me to write some ideas that I've been ruminating for quite some time. And I've been lazy or perhaps discouraged in the past, and his prompt helped me get these things at least in some shape or form. More specific, I want to tell you about these ideas about the role of spatial distributions of, in this case, interventions, which I will define shortly, and how these spatial distributions of interventions determine the functioning of landscapes and how they meet ecosystem service demand in particular. In general, or more in general, and more hopeful I am, that I will be able to fascinate you with the world of spatial distributions and how through them, the three-dimensional space that we live in actually becomes, if you will, infinitely dimensional. I will speak of things small and brief, as well as things that are large and persistent. A world of possibilities will open when we consider the manipulation of spatial distributions of interventions, such as community restoration, burning, plantings, and conservation. And I'm sure you can think of many others. I focus not only on production of ecosystem services, but what perhaps distinguishes the approach is that I will focus on how the production actually meets demand for the ecosystem services. Interventions that support functional units to produce and meet demand for specific ecosystem services is what I'm going to be talking about. So these interventions, of which I gave you examples, will support functional units of different species. Those will provide ecosystem services, and hopefully those services will be distributed in a manner that meets present demand. I will present mainly two theses or hypotheses, depending on how you see it. The first one, which is probably familiar to you, and the second one, maybe not so much. First, the spatial distributions of any given amount of interventions that you apply completely determines the proportion of the demand for an ecosystem service that will be met. So spatial distribution of ecosystem service supply completely determines how much demand is met. Secondly, and perhaps not so clearly, when you consider the spatial distribution of the same kind of interventions with different spatial distributions, once again, the same kind of interventions, we are able to target different ecosystem services because of the relationship between the scales of the service and the distribution of the interventions. A lot of what I will present is based on experimental evidence, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been specifically tested experimentally. So part of the hope is that somebody might pick some of these things up and transform them into experiments. Okay, so what I will talk about more or less as an outline is I will present selected principles of spatial ecology or landscape ecology in relation to ecosystem services. Those hopefully will build up to the final part of the presentation, which is the results of the model, simple model that I made. I want to also present a few select results from inspirational works that I found in the literature, and that really were the engines that made me further develop these ideas. And I'm very grateful to have had those works to read. Briefly, I will present the case for large herbivores, and that is mostly because of my formation. I grew up in science thinking of how large herbivores deal with space and a number of other things. Then I will present this first simple model or attempt to quantify how much ecosystem service demand is actually met as a function of the variables that I mentioned. I will try to put those in, in other contexts briefly So we get out to the details and the specificities of interventions and specific ecosystem services. And then finally, I will present what would be obvious extensions of the approach for further discussion or development. Let me move on then to these selected principles and inspirational works. Different species interact with their environments at a variety of scales. That's more or less common knowledge. For example, the extent of territory needed to have a viable and persistent pack of wolves, the example on the left, is in the order of hundreds of square miles. Whereas foxes, which live in smaller groups, have home ranges which are about an order of magnitude smaller than what's necessary for wolves. And finally, these solitary hedgehogs need just a couple of hectares or live their whole lives and interact with just a couple of hectares. Patches of interventions that are necessary to support one of these species, or as I call them, functional units, will have to have a different minimum size. We need an intervention much larger to maintain a pack of wolves than we need to maintain a sustainable hedgehog functional unit. A total area, for example, of wolf habitat spread into, if you were to take a total area necessary to provide habitat for a pack of wolves, and we spread that into separate patches with little connectivity, then we still have the area of intervention we have incurred in the costs, but we will get zero of the potential services provided by the pack of wolves because we have not provided the minimum unit necessary. I want you to note the difference between the individual and what I call the functional unit. A single wolf is not a functional unit. The functional unit is something that would provide persistence to the wolf population, which I assume would be a pack. Whereas for the hedgehog, those are solitary animals, and they overlap territories, and they only need to meet each other for the mating season. So you can consider that a functional unit would be at least a pair or a mating pair, which live individually separate lives. Therefore, what I'm presenting is telling that there is a correspondence between the scale and the ecosystem services. And once again, this is pretty commonly understood. However, what I'm going to add is that this correspondence seems to consider only one of the dimensions of scale, which is the extent. Okay, and the extent you can liken to the home range if you're thinking of a species, or the area over which a plant or a type of plant has influence, and over which it distributes the ecosystem service of interest. In the conceptual and mathematical model that I present today, I will also emphasize, therefore, the extent of that minimum intervention necessary or habitat necessary for the functional unit to be present. And I see functional units, and I present or I describe them in the model as having two key dimensions. So the first key dimension is that minimum area, which I call the exclusion area, and it's the minimum area of that habitat necessary for the unit to exist. Once again, I call this the exclusion radius, or the minimum radius, if you will. And I assume that within that exclusion radius or minimum radius, no other functional unit can be established. So in the case of the wolves, we can think of the wolves excluding through territoriality other packs of wolves from that area, which is their core area for the living space. But not necessarily they don't exclude other wolves necessarily from all of the areas that they interact with, because potentially at the margins, the home ranges can overlap. The second dimension that the functional units have, which I haven't spoken much about, is what I call the kernel radius. And essentially, this is the radius of the area over which the ecosystem service is supplied by that functional unit. And I will present and describe examples very explicitly. But let's take a look at this diagram here. The main point that I want to you to consider here is that, of course, one species can provide multiple ecosystem services. So when I talk about functional units, we're going to be talking about a specific ecosystem service that I selected for the example. But the whole analysis could be reapplied with the same species and a different ecosystem service. The same species or the same functional unit will have the same minimum radius requirement or exclusion radius, but different ecosystem services provided by that particular function unit will have different kernel radii, potentially. So this is the work from Belsky and Canham from quite a while ago, but this is Acacia trutilis in the African savanna, and it provides a variety of ecosystem services. Soil nutrient enrichment has a kernel which is commensurate with the size of the canopy. We will look at an example from California with oaks that I will show you. It also modifies the diversity, or the ecosystem services providing diversity a little bit in a little bit larger radius, and so on and so forth. There's a variety of kernel radii for different ecosystem services. Therefore, the effect of the spatial distribution and the amount of demand, or the proportion of demand for a particular ecosystem service, depends not only on the species, but also on which ecosystem service we are considering. With this particular distribution that I mimicked here, you can see that perhaps the enhanced understory productivity and tissue nutrient concentrations would be fully met by those three functional units, but the soil nutrient enrichment will leave gaps between one and the other that receive no supply for that demand. The concept that ecosystem services have a certain kernel that determines how they interact with the spatial distributions is not new. And in this book, Principles of Landscape Ecology by Farina, he shows a clear example of how the kernel of seed dispersal, in this case, we're considering the seed dispersal by birds, seed dispersal by birds, which have a kernel between 50 and 150 meters. And those birds are acting from centers which are in the forest. This describes two kinds of approaches to pasture land in forest. A traditional clearing, which is a large hole in the forest, or clearing, if you will. And the other one is a more dispersed or interspersed kind of clearing. Upon abandoning the pastures, the rate and the degree to which the forest can recover will depend on the interaction between the kernel, which is the bird distribution or kernel of seed distribution, and the spatial distribution of areas that demand that, which is the previously cleared area. So this is a clear example, and it's already in that book, in which those two scales, the scale of the demand and the scale or the kernel of the supply of ecosystem services, interact in a predictable manner. So I'm interested in expanding what I'm doing, and trying to expand this to more explicitly consider a variety of distributions, a variety of levels of ecosystem service demand, and a variety of functional units. Another work that was inspirational to me is when I saw this analysis of the supply and demand of an ecosystem service, which would be the availability of after-work recreation. So the upper left graph shows the areas that provide after-work recreation opportunity. Now, those areas are shown not with their kernel, but they're shown with their minimum area, if you will. That's all of the area that has opportunity. The upper right picture shows the demand, which is essentially the location of people who work and would like to have after-work recreation. And then in this case, things are already set by the distribution of parks and residential areas. So the bottom picture shows how the interaction of the distribution of the supply interact with the demand. Now, in this case, I'm thinking the kernel for the supply seems to be, or is actually provided by the demanding unit. So in this case, the kernel is just reversed, but essentially is represented by the fact that the farther away a person demanding recreation lives from a recreation spot, or a spot that provides recreation, the less available or the less valuable that supply becomes. So that's the tails of the kernel that describe that distribution for the recreational opportunities. So I guess the message I wanted to give with this particular picture too is that although the total quantity of the service may be equal or greater than the demand, not all demand is met because of the limitations imposed by the spatial distribution and the mismatch between one and the other. There was a seminal work, and most of the concepts that I present today were posed in this seminal work by Limburg and colleagues. But although they inspired me, they inspired me to go a little bit further because they did not consider the spatial distribution of the demand for ecosystem services. But this graph specifically shows the proportion of the landscape area that receives an intervention in the x-axis, and then the level of ecosystem service generation. They didn't consider demand either, but the level of generation in the vertical axis. So their work poses different relationships between the amount of the interventions, what you see in these graphs, such as flower strips, they consider no-till agriculture, wetland restoration, and hedgerows. And although their work also focuses on the scales of interventions, the spatial distribution of those interventions is not explored, and it is implicit. The paper considers 3 scales of interventions, which I interpret as 3 extents over which the intervention units of standard size are distributed uniformly. I don't remember if that's specifically explained. But in reality, these curves can refer to exactly the same ecosystem service at the same scale, but differing in spatial distribution. For example, you will see that the curve A at the upper left and the curve B, the curve, I should have said C, yes, the curve C in the lower left, those two will be obtained in the model simply by changing the kernel radius and the exclusion radius of the same type of functional units or across functional units. So you will see this specifically, the 2 responses that you see here in a single example, which is the bumblebee example that I will present. So moving on from inspirational works, let me move on to the specific case of large herbivores. And I'll try to make this up quick, but I want to elicit some of the ideas that I will apply to the model later. The geometry of the distributions determines impact. That's the message that I'm going to continue to repeat to you. In specific, I'm considering in this case 2 types of geometry. The most complex, which is at the top, which you can think of as a fractal type of geometry, which has patterns embedded inside patterns. And the bottom one, which is a simple Euclidean geometry. What you see in those pictures, there's 2 rows. The top is a fractal distribution and the impacts of what happens with the fractal distribution, and the lower one, the Euclidean. Both distributions in the left start with 43% of the field area. This is actual measurements, and the upper left is an actual measurement. This is the distribution of a weed that's very aversive to animals. So these weeds actually create a kernel of anti-service around them because the animals reject areas around them. So what happens when this distribution of plants, or how much of the land is affected by this distribution of plants, depending on the size of the kernel? I consider in the columns 2 and 3, 2 sizes of the kernel, which are represented by the standard deviation of a normal distribution. One kernel with, which is 1 meter away from the weed, and the other one 3 meters away. And they did the same with a geometric distribution at the bottom. In a simple geometric distribution, the impact is a 9% increase of impacted area. Whereas in the fractal distribution, the impacted area increases to 59 and finally to 80%. So that's a clear quantitative representation of the impact of the different nature of the spatial distribution on the total effect of the weed on that landscape. And just to give you an actual example, this is an aerial photo of the place where the other picture was managed, but there's two clear places in this field. On the left, you have the yellow, bright yellow areas are the weed. And on the left side of that creek, you can see very clearly separate, what would be a geometric or a Euclidean geometric distribution between desirable plants, which are the reddish and darker, and weed, which is the bright one. And on the right, you see a fine interspersion. Because of the fine interspersion, the whole field on the right side is impacted by the weed, and the animals simply completely avoid it. So all of the dark area, which is desirable forage in there, is affected by that distribution and rendered useless simply because of the spatial distribution. I'm going to move on to an intervention, which would be burning. The main thing I want you to get from this slide is that burning in grasslands essentially reduces the amount of mass of forage and increases the quality. That's, it's a simplistic way to view it, but that's what I want to emphasize. And this is based on some work that we did in Kenya with burns with different scales and different spatial distributions. The low forage mass caused by the burning limits the intake rate, or the rate at which the grazers can gather the forage, and the low forage quality in the unburned areas limits the rate at which they can digest the forage. And in simple terms, the balance between one and the other depends on the size of the herbivore. So this figure shows on the vertical axis the preference for burnt patches as a function of patch size in the x-axis, and then as a function of animal size with the different graphs. The effect of the intervention grain, in this case, the size of the patch that was burned, clearly depends on the species. Hares at the top, which are monogastrics and small, require very high quality forage in small amounts. And therefore, they're able to strongly prefer patches regardless of their size. They can even select when they are very small patches. Impala are medium-sized ruminants and tolerate low quality forage, but prefer they tolerate low quality forage, but they prefer high quality burns. But they are restricted in the size of the burns because when they are too small, they are not large enough for them to consume all the food that they need. So the preference increases with the size of the burn. And conversely, for elephants, monogastrics are very, very large, who require large quantities of food and can tolerate very low qualities. They actually select against the patches, particularly when they are large enough, commensurate with their body size, and allows them to be selected. So I have presented to you all of the principles that I want to bring to bear and the example for the large herbivores. So let me move on to this first model. And the question that I want to ask is, what might happen when the distributions of interventions are modified? And as a corollary of that, how might we modify the distributions of interventions to make sure that we obtain not only the amount of ecosystem service that we need, but we obtain it in a distribution that actually meets demand? I'm going to consider the spatial distribution of kernels in a variety of scales, or actually extents. And the largest one in the extent, or at least close to the largest, is this northern harrier. Take, for example, the predation services that northern harriers provide. These birds need a nesting habitat that consists of a couple of hectares of undisturbed tall grassland. Once a pair of birds establishes a nest in such an area, it will defend the territory and a hunting territory that can range between 10 and 300 hectares. So the nesting area is the exclusion area, which is a few hectares, in which cannot be more than one nesting pair. But the kernel radius, which is the area over which they hunt, can be up to 300 hectares. So for these animals, I explore, in actually all cases, I explore as a means of sensitivity analysis, two radii and two kernel radii of ecosystem service provision and two exclusion radii. For this particular bird, I chose 150 and 250 meters for the amount of grassland, protected grassland necessary for the nesting bird. And I explored 250 and 500 meters for the ecosystem service kernel. You can consider in this landscape that a few patches, maybe 4, 5, 6 centers, like a patch right there in the center, could provide sufficient predation services for quite a large area. And a few additional centers with protected grasslands could essentially almost meet, depending on the spatial distribution of the demand, but almost meet the demand. So here are the 3 examples that I used for the model. In addition to the Northern Herian example, which is in the lower left here, I simulated the soil quality services provided by oaks and the pollination services provided by bumblebees, oaks in the upper left and the bumblebees on the upper right. Each one of these graphs shows the relationship between the service kernel, the ecosystem service kernel, which are the red and the black bell-shaped curves. And there's 2 because, as I said, I'm exploring 2 different sizes, so 2 different radii. So we explored the relationship between those, and the exclusion radii represented by the horizontal color lines in green and blue. For example, the oaks provide a soil service which is primarily within the area that they occupy. It doesn't move a whole lot further away from them. So the ratio of exclusion radius to kernel service radius is about 1. It's very, very low. On the other hand, on the upper right, bumblebees providing pollination services can provide these services up to 1 kilometer away from the colony. And the colony only requires about a radius of 10 to 20 meters of preserved specific habitat. So the ratio of service or kernel, the ratio of kernel radius to required minimum radius is very, very large. And as you will see, this is going to be the main pattern in the results. So this shows a big picture view of the effects of the spatial distribution of the spatial distribution and kernel exclusion radius ratios. Don't worry about reading any of the labels for this, and don't worry about the details, the small stuff. I don't expect you to see that. What I want to show you here is the big pattern that it emerges. So let me explain and organize the interpretation for you. Each set of 12 graphs for each one of the 3 types of ecosystem services and organisms is a combination of 3 columns, and each column represents 1 level of ecosystem service demand. So from very low relative to the amount provided by 1 unit or 1 functional unit, all the way to high. Which, by the way, I forgot to point out, those are the horizontal black lines are the 3 levels of demand that I used. And the levels of demand, which are uniform across the landscape, are gauged or scaled on the basis of the kernel. So I have 1 demand that is low for both kernels, 1 demand that is high for 1 kernel, but low for the other one, and 1 demand that is very high for all kernels studied. So those are the three levels of demand in the 3 columns in each set of graphs. And then the rows are the 4 combinations of exclusion radius and ecosystem service kernel radius. And the main trend that you will see here is that oaks have the smallest kernel to exclusion ratio on the top left. They are followed in the lower right by the northern harriers with an intermediate ratio, and then in the right by the bumblebees that have the highest ratio. The vertical axis shows the proportion of the total demand of ecosystem service, which is met by each specific distribution and amount of interventions. And the horizontal axis represents the amount of intervention as a proportion of the landscape size. So this is how much was actually done to create habitat or planted or burned or what have you. The blue lines represent the interventions which have a size which is equal to the radius required for one functional unit, and those are distributed uniformly across the landscape. And the red lines represent those units necessary for each functional unit clumped at the center of the landscape. All the graphs have a red line, but when the red line is not visible, it is behind and equal to the blue line. So the most important thing that I want to see here, or want you to see here, is that the difference between the blue line and the red lines, meaning the impact of the spatial distribution, increases from the oak trees to the bumblebees. And that's a direct consequence of the ratio between the exclusion or minimum radius and the kernel radius. When the demand of the demand of service per unit landscape is very high relative to the kernel scale, it is also impossible to meet a large proportion of the demand. So as we increase the demand, we move to the right columns, you can see that the total amount or the total proportion supply becomes smaller. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the graphs show a very significant high order interaction. There's interactions of the highest order present in all of the results. And these are very hard to understand and to use unless we have an explicit and quantitative model. So for all of these results, I have considered that the functional areas of the kernels can overlap, so they are additive. But what would happen if these animals were completely territorial, or these functional units, and they excluded themselves from providing a service in one place or another? So I explore that in one additional way, where I consider exclusive versus additive service. The orange is the new case, is the exclusive, and the additive is the case that you saw before. And I'm showing you exactly the same situation for the bumblebees here, except that I'm adding the orange one. The main result here is that the exclusion reduces the efficiency of the interventions when the interventions are, particularly when they are clustered, except when the demand is very high at the very bottom, that you can see that with both of the distributions, the uniform at the top and the cluster at the bottom, continuous line, both of them are severely restricted when the services are excluded from each other. So this would be a direct consequence of the fact that the services cannot be stacked from different functional units. So that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you about the model and the main results. I want to move on, and I think I've spoken for enough time, and mention a couple of things.
Emilio, we got
in conclusion. Time. Well, I just want to make a couple of things. I think I like to, I get tired of listening to myself. So let me just make a couple of additional points, and then we'll see if we can have time for questions. This particular slide here, I want to bring to your attention a couple of things, that the supply kernels are not necessarily static as I depicted them. So if we introduce a temporal dimension, then they can be adaptable and the results would change accordingly. Presumably, I suspect that adaptable kernels of distribution of ecosystem services will lead to a better efficiency of any particular distribution. And you can see in herbivores, for example, in this case, it's very similar to the example for the recreational space, except that in this case, the forage is in a set place, and the distribution kernel for the use of that forage is the ability, or given by the ability of animals to reach the forage, and by the cost and difficulty and distance involved when the animals need to go and reach that forage. But the animals will certainly adapt and reorganize that kernel to achieve a best balance for them that particular time. So what I expect in that sense is a better efficiency. So let me skip through I can tell you if you have a question about how I would put this in other contexts, but just move on to what the obvious extensions and next steps would be, which I kind of briefly mentioned already. But one of the first extension is completely spatial. So if we take all of these concepts and perhaps the simple model that I put together and start playing with it, we can start planning or thinking of planning precision scale management, if you will, not only scale and distribution. So the spatial, we can test different spatial distributions of resources and the generated spatial distributions of kernels of ecosystem services. And those become the equivalent of niche dimensions in the sense that we can, and I'm talking using the word niche in a very generic sense. We could address different ensembles of ecosystem services, or we can, depending on what scale and what distributions favor one or another. And then related to that as a corollary, the same intervention can target, the same amount of intervention can target completely different ecosystem services depending on how we distribute it. Just to give you a very obvious case, the same type of intervention protecting areas with tall herbaceous vegetation can be used for the bumblebees and for the hawks. But a bumblebee requires a much smaller area to establish a colony. So we can take 10% of the landscape and make it into patches which are far apart from each other, the size of what a bumblebee needs. And we will get a lot of bumblebee pollination services, but zero hawk service, because we don't have a single patch in there that's suitable for one hawk functional unit. And of course, we can do the reverse, do large patches, and then we get fewer bumblebees, but we get more hawks. So the distribution is a dimension over which we can target specific services. And the last thing is obvious, is we need to incorporate the temporal aspects. Of course, these things are dynamic, and we can control not only the spatial distribution of interventions, but also the temporal distribution. And I think the simultaneous ability to manipulate many of these dimensions and spatial temporal distributions will open a lot of opportunities for designing landscapes and for addressing specific management challenges. Thank you so much for the time that you took to listen to me and listen. Yeah, thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Emilio. That was a wonderful talk. I've learned a lot. So it was fantastic, and that's why exactly we want you in this way of thinking together. So man, that was wonderful. So and now I'm open the room for questions to Emilio. We got around 15 minutes remaining in this breakout room. If there is not any question, I will start with one. Emilio, you said you were going to provide a little bit more context or a little bit more examples of that, especially one of the last slides you got there with the sheep. Could you develop that a little bit more?
And that would be, I think, Pablo, that would be great for other people too. I know that everybody has lots of ideas for that, and it'd be nice to hear about it. So the main idea is that we can interpret grazing and the use of graced landscapes as providing an ecosystem service that, because of the heterogeneity, I am assuming there's heterogeneity in the graced landscape in terms of forage services, that we can view that as this play between demand and supply. And the kernel in this case is created by the spatial distribution of the animals. So you can think the kernel, of course, it's not going to be anything like what I showed before. And I tried to create this green line here, which could be a kernel. So it's high, there's an area which is very high quality, high availability, low in areas that have the weed or whatever, high again. So it could be very irregular and adaptable, but it is, that kernel will integrate not only the characteristics of the forage at the place, but the ability of the animals to move to and find that forage. So yeah, so I'm curious about what others might have to say about that in particular.
Yeah. It seems like everybody's very shy, Emilio. So yeah. So anyways, I see, in the screen there, you got that in the sharing and sparing context.
So this is
some
the
of
other thing
my students are in there. So I would be, I don't want to mention any of my students here or there, but I think they would have some questions about that.
Oh, I know there's people in the audience who know a lot about this and who have very good ideas, because I've talked to them, but but they are not willing to share. But this is actually, and I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I do want to thank one of the reviewers of the manuscript. Brought this up and made me think about it. So there's this thing called the land sparing issue, let me call it, and apparently this is completely out of my field, or I was completely ignorant, and I am now mostly ignorant about this. But because of the reviewer, I learned about it, and I was able to think about it and put my my description in the context. So the idea in the land sharing sparing context is the main issue is how to integrate production and productive services, particularly agriculture and livestock production, with the preservation of wild areas and areas that produce ecosystem services that need to be somewhat, if you will, wild. So the land sharing paradigm essentially is the idea of incorporating, if you will, benign interventions to the otherwise agricultural landscape. In this case, it's talking like flower strips, which could be at a small scale, or including, more extensive areas of grassland with flowers for pollinators. Okay, so there's an integration in the land sharing between if you will, the areas providing the ecosystem services, which are non-agricultural, and the completely agricultural areas. On the other end is the land sparing, which is the paradigm is preserve the land separate, preserve wild land separate, completely separate from agriculture. In that way, you can maintain it in a more pristine, more, if you will, functional way, and then have agriculture in completely separate landscapes. And the model the way I see this, and I did not know this before, and I didn't have the opportunity to have my ideas shaped by this concept, unfortunately. But the way I saw it now is that I tend to see things as a continuum of scales. So at least in my mind, part of the issue of land sharing and land sparing is a difference in the distribution of the different types of lands. Of course, I'm not going to say that a flower strip is the same as a small piece of pristine forest. But in the sense that there's going to be areas, we're considering two types of areas that provide these ecosystem services, which are not necessarily related to heavily disruptive agricultural practices, and then areas where the heavily disruptive agricultural practices happen. or not, or perhaps not heavily, but somewhat disruptive. So then we can start thinking of distribution of the, how the spatial distribution of those things is created. So with a spatial distribution which is completely distinct one and the other, we would be in the land sparing end. And if you start interspersing the two types of land, you would be moving into a land sharing, at least part of the dimension for me becomes that. So they're kind of united, and it is a continuum between land sparing and land sharing. And that can be best seen, and at least in my mind, when people think about intercropping, which is one way to very directly use these ideas of interspersing the demand and the supply of ecosystem services. So intercropping has been shown for a number of things that is very efficient. And the question that I bring, or the view that I propose to people, which may be unusual, is to consider that, and specifically in one of the results of the experiments, and one of these meta-analysis and experiments that were done, they found that intercropping was not different between small patches or small bands and large bands, so to speak. I'm simplifying, but intercropping of either size versus single cropping was very different. And then what I propose, the change of view that I propose, is that separate fields of different species could be seen as intercropping at with a very large grain. So there's a continuum. Imagine that you have, in the upper right here, you have these fields. Suppose that the dark green is one crop, and another one, the yellow is another crop. You say, well, there's no intercropping there, or maybe these two at the top here. No, there isn't. But what if you started making them smaller and closer together? At one point, they're going to stop being two different fields with different crops, and they will become what people call intercropping. So, at the very least, a good part of the difference between intercropping or regular cropping is just the difference in the degree of interspersion between two different species. And mentally, we're used to thinking that there's some sort of a hard difference between one and the other, but there isn't. It's a continuum. And I'm always curious, and I ask people to do the mental exercises. Okay, here's two fields. You see two fields? Yes, I see two fields. There's two different crops. Do you have intercropping? No. And then I start partitioning them into smaller fields, one alternating with the other, and keep asking them, is it intercropping? Is it intercropping? Is it intercropping? Different people will answer at different scales, but obviously, at least a good aspect of this is a continuum of spatial scales. And to emphasize the point, I guess the main point that I wanted to make with my presentation is, we don't have to be trapped into that dichotomy of it is or it is not. The whole range of possibilities is open for us to choose from. And we can use different ranges in some places than other places when we design the landscapes.
That's fantastic, Emilio. I was looking forward to hear that. I don't know if Juan Villalba is still in the room, that we've been thinking with Juan about these sort of things, and we got some thoughts, not in my group here, but in the university, and we. That people, when they think of the high hill country level, they are still trapped in that dichotomy, whether it is regenerate part of the natural forest or don't touch it and have super productive islands that I personally struggle with. Right? So this approach that you are saying it's something more of my taste, if you like, and. I look Arthur here as well, and because we are in a room, Arthur, more intimate, if you like. Hopefully, with these sort of things, we can end up working with you as soon as you can get to New Zealand. But it's been quite a lot, and when you talk with farmers about that, especially this part of the world, so well, what should we preserve? What should we conserve? What should we regenerate? What should we not touch? It's the constant trap in that dichotomy, one or the other, and even happen at the biggest systems productions, right? So fantastic. I'm glad I asked that question, Emilio. It was wonderful. Here we got a comment from Juan. So I would encourage you, Juan, to pose this question again in the last questions and answers, whole rooms together, all the rooms together.